All right, you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. Not that one, but this one. And like always, I'm going to get straight into it because I want to keep these stories coming to you guys. This is another one for the series that I've been running on some of the hypocrisies that were taking place when death row was still in San Quentin. So anyways, without further ado, let me get into it. So for those of you that watched the last story that I put out on Snappy from Coachella, this story right here took place right around the same time. This took place around 2018, around the same time when they started moving all the validated condemned inmates from the Adjustment Center to East Block. So just to put this story in perspective for you guys, it's basically about two sureños that checked in and then were allowed to come back into the fold a couple years later, and then they were utilized to take care of something that I'll get into when I get into the story. So like I said, this story took place sometime around 2018, and for those of you that watch the Snappy story, everything that was going on at that time was going on at this time, because again, these two incidents, they happened around the same time. So I don't need to get into the details and rehash everything that I talked about in that last story. So the crux of this story involves three individuals: Robert Castro, Dopey from Pomona, David Ponce, Santos from Watts, and Gabriel Ronquillo, Gari from Whittier. So according to several of my sources that helped me with this story, Dopey was one of a handful of individuals that was moved from the Adjustment Center to East Block. And again, these moves were on the tail end of some of the federal court rulings that came down, and after CDCR implemented several changes that directly affected condemned inmates that were validated. Now, I'm not sure if Dopey was validated or if it was just a timing issue, but when all these moves were being facilitated from the Adjustment Center, he was one of a handful of individuals that moved from the Adjustment Center to East Block. Ronnie, Hector, Smokey, and several others were gradually moved to East Block. So like the rest of them, when Dopey moved from the Adjustment Center to East Block, he basically went from having nothing to having all kinds of privileges and being given all kinds of luxuries and incentives that he hadn't had since he had been there in San Quentin. I mean, at that time in the Adjustment Center, they were slammed down. They literally had nothing over there. So it was almost instant. They moved to East Block and now they're afforded with all these privileges that they hadn't had for years. So I'm sure Dopey's head was spinning like the rest of them. You know, like I said in Snappy's story, the Adjustment Center used to serve as the SHU program for the condemned inmates in San Quentin. In comparison to what they allowed them to have in East Block, they had nothing in the Adjustment Center, standard issue. They allowed them to have a TV, a radio, thermals, sweats, tennis shoes, and some other miscellaneous property. But overall, that was pretty much all they allowed them to have over there in the Adjustment Center. But that was pretty much it. Even their canteen draw was restricted to $35 under grade B status. You know, back in the late 90s, when I did a lot of time in the Adjustment Center, it was a cool place to be, especially for ADSEG inmates. Probably not for death row, but for ADSEG inmates that didn't have nothing. When we go to the Adjustment Center as ADSEG inmates, we get hooked up over there, either by some of the BGF members that we used to go to yard with, or if we landed on the tier where there were some Crips and Bloods, they would look out. I told you guys this before in some of my past stories, but even some of the Mexican Mafia members and some of the Aryan Brotherhood members that were there in the Adjustment Center at that time would look out. And I'm talking about Billy Ray Hamilton, Chato Sandoval, Hector Ayala. I was never on a tier with Ronnie, so I can't speak for Ronnie. But as far as I know, he was on the same page as far as looking out for active Northerners that would come through there and land on some of those tiers. These guys were looking at the death penalty. They weren't on that North-South bullshit. They were on some other shit. Every time I landed in the Adjustment Center, I got hooked up. Somebody would shoot me a radio, thermals, sweats, even canteen. So there came a point in time where whenever I would go back to San Quentin on a parole violation or even a new commitment, I would hope when I was in R&R, I was hoping that they would send me to the adjustment center because I knew I would get things that I wouldn't get anywhere else, especially in East Block. So again, in the late 90s, the adjustment center was a cool spot to be housed at, especially if you were an ADSEG inmate. However, everything would end up changing a couple years later when the Mexican Mafia went to war with the administration. After several COs got gassed, there were spearings, they were getting slashed over there. They flipped the whole program and the adjustment center wasn't a cool spot to be at anymore. They spent money to make it that way too. So the way the adjustment center used to have bars in front of the cells, and then there was mesh or steel grate that covered the bars. But it was open. You could talk to your neighbors, you could hear on the tier. But then after the Mexican Mafia got into it with the COs that worked in the adjustment center, came in, they put in solid doors, they sealed everything up, and they tightened up the whole program. After that, it was like being in a submarine in there. You were completely sealed up and you couldn't even hear your neighbor talk. So it was all messed up after that. And then they stopped allowing the ADSEG inmates to be housed over there. So it was all exclusively death row after that. So as you guys can imagine, when Ronnie, Hector, Smokey, Dopey, and some of the others that were in the adjustment center, when they all moved to East Block in this big, massive move, it was a huge transition to these guys. Again, they went from the bare minimum to having everything and some. In the adjustment center, again, it's like the shoe, so you weren't even allowed to use a phone. There were guys that were housed in the adjustment center that hadn't had an opportunity to get on a phone in years, decades. But again, this is typical for being in a SHU program. So now these guys get to East Block and they're allowed to use the institutional phone that comes right to your cell. It's on a roll cart that slides up and down the tier. And there was also contraband cell phones since they got contact visits. This change was literally like night and day. Now they're in East Block, they're allowed to go full canteen draws. Like I told you guys, when they're in the adjustment center, they were only allowed to go $35. $35 doesn't go that far. Couple bags of chips, some cookies, your soups, some Zuzus and Wham Whams, your necessities, and boom, you're tapped out. That's it. But now you're over there in East Block and you're allowed to go $150, $200. That's a big thing. That's a big change. And you know, it's the little things in prison like that that mean a lot. But I'm sure when they were getting afforded all these privileges, they were probably saying like, damn, this is too good to be true. Now I understand why these cats want to come to East Block. As far as their property, now they're allowed to have musical instruments, hot pots, fans, typewriters, hobby and craft. They allow them to have a lot of property. And these cells are small. If you guys are looking at the pictures, San Quentin's got some of the smallest cells out of all the prisons that I've been to. They're like closets. You can literally put one hand on one wall and put your other hand out and touch the other wall. That's how small they are. But these guys, when they allow them to have all this property, it's like they're packed in. It's crazy. I tried to find some of the best pictures I could to show you guys how some of these cells looked when they were in East Block. These were the best ones I was able to find. Anyways, the other thing that they allowed in East Block that was probably the most important thing and something none of these guys had since they had been there in San Quentin was contact visits. Having the ability to touch your girl or to hold your kids is priceless. But for some of them, they weren't even thinking about that. They were only thinking about one thing. Contact visits meant clavo. It meant now they had a pipeline to bring in clavo. I'm sure some of them were thinking about the financial gains and how this could benefit them, but others were thinking about how they were going to get smacked back and gouged out once they got their hands on some of the clavo. So now that I got all that out the way, let me get into the crux of the story. So I don't know Dopey's history when it comes to clavo, but with a name like Dopey, it's probably safe to assume that he's dabbled once or twice in his lifetime. So Dopey, he gets moved to East Block, and right off the bat, he starts getting loaded. And he was apparently doing this despite the fact that Ronnie had implemented a zero tolerance policy when it came to Chris. Like I told you guys in the Snappy story, Ronnie allowed these guys to drink, to smoke Yeska, and to use black. But when it came to Chris, he didn't tolerate it and he didn't like it because of some of the effects that it was having on some of these guys. So they were basically allowed to use everything else. But when it came to Chris, if they got caught using it, they faced huge fines, or depending on the situation and the individual, they potentially faced serious consequences. But Dopey, he either didn't care or the temptation to dabble was too much for him because he got caught using on several different occasions. Well, technically, he didn't get caught. He actually gave himself up because he went on one and started tweaking on the tier. So as you guys know from several of my stories, Ronnie's been known to be a hardliner and he's a no-nonsense type of guy. However, he wasn't beyond giving his people a second chance, especially if he took a liking to you. So apparently, he gave Dopey several chances to stop indulging and to get himself focused. But Dopey couldn't do it. Dopey continued to use and he continued to keep getting caught. And he failed to heed his warnings. At one point, when Dopey was walking on thin ice, Ronnie even fined him as a last-ditch effort to get him to stop. But even that was to no avail. I guess the temptation was too strong for Dopey because he kept sinking deeper and deeper into that hole. Towards the end, he tried to hide it and keep it under wraps. But when you stay up for 5-6 days consecutively and you're not getting no sleep, so after several days of not sleeping, at some point he starts to hallucinate. He's in his cell hallucinating and, he's stuck in his own thoughts. He starts tweaking until he jumps up, gets on his bars, and then he starts yelling off his bars. So after Ronnie hears about it, he issues Dopey his last and final warning. And he basically tells him, look, if you don't stop, you're going to get the mono treatment. Or he tells him something along the lines, if you don't stop, it's going to be all bad for you. So Dopey, he gets the message. He sees the writing on the wall, and at that point, he checks in. At that point, he probably figured it didn't matter what he did. He had been warned so many times that he felt like Ronnie was gunning for him at that point. So Dopey, he strikes up a long kite and he addresses it to Ronnie and the other sureños on death row. And he basically tells them, look, I'm done. I'm stepping back. I'm doing my own thing. I'm tired of getting pushed and pulled. However, I'm not going to cause no problems. I'm not going to interfere with you guys' business. I'm just stepping back, doing my own thing. So he made it official. He checks in. So according to my source, after Dopey struck up this kite, he stayed in his cell for several years. And the only time he ever came out of his cell was during massive shakedowns where it was mandatory for them to take everybody out to the yard and put them in individual walk-alone cages while they came in and did these massive searches. So Santos from Watts was another sureño who had been there on the row at that point for about 5 or 6 years. And like Dopey, he also had issues with the clavo. He couldn't leave it alone and he got caught several times tweaking on the tier. And because of his antics, he was another one that Ronnie had warned several times to stop using or they were going to be done with him. But I mean, think about it. These guys, they're obviously indulging and they're struggling with their addictions and they get warned several times to stop using, but they're in the cell by themselves. So they probably thought that, I could continue to use and nobody's going to know about it. I'll just try to mask it and hide it the best way I can. And that's what they were doing. And obviously, this was a cycle that they couldn't break. It was bigger than them. So Santos, he goes on a good one. He stays up for about 5 or 6 days, and like Dopey, he started hallucinating. He thinks the whole tier is plotting against him. He thinks everybody's scheming against him. He thinks that the next time he goes to yard that they're gonna pack him out and that they're all talking about him and they're waiting for him to come out of his cell, and he's on a good one. He was on such a good one that he even thought the COs were tampering with his food, they were playing with his mail, that they wouldn't allow his family to come in and see him, that they were stopping his correspondence with people out there on the streets, and that there was some kind of big, massive conspiracy against him. It got so bad for him that he started foaming at the mouth, threw himself on the floor, started flopping around like a fish. So they had to take him to the psych ward on the 4th floor. I don't know how long he stayed on the 4th floor, but as soon as he came back, like Dopey, he also struck up a long kite addressed to Ronnie and the other sureños, and he basically let them know that he was also stepping back and that he was converting to Christianity. So he makes it official, he checks in, and he stops going to the yard as well. And according to my source, it wasn't 5 or 6 years like Dopey, but he stopped going to yard for about a year. So it's safe to assume that they put him on the lista. This seemed to have become a common theme with respects to some of these guys that were indulging. They start using, they get warned, they tweak out, and then they end up in bad standings. You know, Dopey, Santos, and Gari were only 3 of many that this happened to. But this even happened to Soldier Boy from Paramount. After Soldier Boy took out Mono from Torrance, someone turned him on to some Chris, and he ended up getting all tweaked out. Like the others, he stayed up for about a week straight, started hallucinating, crashed out, started J-catting off, and started talking shit off his bars. Supposedly, he jumped out on the tier and started threatening all his neighbors after believing that they were all plotting against him. As a result of his indiscretions, he almost got the Mono treatment himself. He ended up getting greenlit, they put 2 shooters on him, and they almost took him out. Now here's the thing, none of my sources were aware as to why Ronnie chose to clear these guys and bring them back into the fold. Nobody seen any excessive fishing or communication with them that would have been consistent with them being offered some kind of resolution. They weren't seen out on the walk-alone yards talking to Ronnie or any of his minions, so none of it made any sense. And then of course, since my sources were no longer active themselves, they weren't in the loop and they weren't privy to what was going on behind the scenes. They didn't do any cleanup, otherwise everybody would have known about it. And besides that, they hadn't been out to the yard. Some of my sources believed that they might have paid some hefty fines or that Ronnie might have worked out some other type of sinister arrangement with them behind the scenes, like maybe agreeing to owe some cleanup later or something like that. At any rate, one day my source is out on the yard in one of the walk-alone cages, and he just so happens to look over towards yard 1, and he sees Dopey and Santos huddled up with Ronnie and Hector. This came as a complete surprise, as everyone thought that these guys were done and that they both had green lights on them. My source said it blew his mind that he even seen these guys on the yard. And you gotta understand, these guys hadn't been out to the yard in a long time. Dopey hadn't been out there for 5 or 6 years. Santos hadn't been out there for a year. So it had been a long time since they had been out to the yard. So my source said that he just continued to watch the movement on that yard, because even though it looked like everything was all good out there, that there was still a strong possibility that these guys were being led into a trap and that it could still be hit out there. But nothing ended up happening. After Dopey and Santos were embraced by Ronnie and Hector, they were then embraced by all the other active sureños on that yard. But even after several days after these guys made their first appearance on that yard, a lot of people continued to watch the movement out there, thinking that these guys were still gonna get moved on, that it was just delayed reaction. But nothing happened. So fast forward a couple weeks later, my source is back out on a walk-alone yard, and he looks over towards yard 1 and he notices something unusual about the movement out there. He could just tell by the way that people were moving out there that something was about to kick off that day. His spidey senses were tingling, and something in his gut told him that something was about to happen. He didn't know who was going to be involved or what was going on, but there was a break in the normal routine, which is usually indicative that something's gonna kick off. There's pull-up bars out there, there's a basketball court, and there's other things that are usually being done out there that weren't being done that day. Aside from that, the movement was different out there. And when you've trained your spidey senses to key in and detect these kinds of things, you know what to look for. So at some point, my source looks back over towards yard 1 and he sees Dopey and Santos take flight on another sureño, Gabriel Ronquillo, Gari from Whittier. So Gari is an active sureño, but he's described as being a straight J-cat. And for those of you who don't know what a J-cat is, this is the short version. A Cat J is a classification title that CDCR uses to describe someone who isn't playing with the full deck, someone that has mental issues. And Gari had a reputation on death row as being someone that was known for getting high and for talking a lot of shit off his bars. And he didn't discriminate. He did it to the Woods, he did it to the Africanos, to the active sureños, to the non-active sureños. Whoever he wanted to cuss out, he cussed them out. He got away with it for a long time because he'd get loaded, J-cat off on the tier, sober up, and then kiss Ronnie and Hector's ass to get a pass. But apparently that only worked for so long, because eventually they even got impatient with him. So one day, for whatever reason, Gari decides to cuss out a Wood named Eddie Morgan. I'm not even going to tell you guys what type of individual he is. I'm just going to throw the narrative of his charges up so you guys can see it for yourselves. Let's just say he classifies as one of them cats who falls under crimes of moral turpitude. Something else I explained in the Snappy story. So this guy Eddie Morgan, he's out there on the 1 yard with Ronnie. And keep in mind, this is supposed to be an active yard. But he's out there on the yard with Ronnie, and for whatever reason, Ronnie takes a liking to this guy, Eddie. My source said that this guy even tried to start acting like he was programming with the Sureños. In all fairness to Ronnie, I wouldn't go as far as saying that he was embracing them as one of his own, but he did allow them to coexist out there on the yard. So at some point, Eddie apparently told Ronnie that Gargi disrespected him, that he called him out of his name, and he's just out there on the yard complaining about it. And I guess at that point, Ronnie felt like he had seen enough of Gargi's antics and that it was time to teach him a lesson. So what does Ronnie do? He sends Dopey, Santos, and another upstate Sureño who they call Guilty to hit Gargi. All three of these guys had bangers too, but this ended up turning into a comedy show. So they play Gargi into one of the back corners of the yard by using some kind of ruse, and then they get on him. And let me just say this, Gargi, he might be a J-Cat with a big mouth, but when it comes to fighting for his life, that dude wasn't playing. He basically ended up embarrassing all three of these guys. This little fool with his pterodactyl arms started throwing haymakers and went into straight Tasmanian devil mode. They couldn't even get close to this guy. They were scared to. And he was fast too. My source said that he started doing some acrobatic type of shit where he ran to the wall, ran up the wall a couple of feet, and then came down all crazy. He said it was funnier than shit. He said he couldn't stop laughing and that some of the other Sureños that were on the yard couldn't stop laughing because this dude went on a sick one. I don't even think these guys hit him with their pieces. If they did, they just scratched him because they couldn't get close to him. My source said they were swinging their pieces at him, but this dude was so quick and was doing some crazy type of shit that they didn't want to take a chance of getting knocked out. So needless to say, at some point, the gunner sees what's happening, he blows his whistle, and he hits the alarm. At that point, once the alarm starts going off, he fires off 2 or 3 rounds from the knee knocker, also known as Big Bertha. So then everybody prones out, and that was pretty much the end of it. So from there, they go through the meticulous process of taking one guy off the yard at a time, cuffing him up, and then escorting him back to his cell. So Dopey, Santos, Gargi, and Guilty were all medically cleared and rehoused in the adjustment center. They took him back to the adjustment center. They get back over to the adjustment center, they stay there for 90 days, and then eventually they move them back to East Block. Yup, all 4 were brought back, placed back on yard 1 with Ronnie, Hector, and this white guy, Eddie Morgan, who this all started over. Obviously, I don't know what kind of determination they made or why they felt comfortable with bringing these guys back. They must have felt comfortable enough knowing that nothing was gonna happen, because they put them all back on the same yard. Anyways, with that being said, my source said that these were the type of hypocrisies that continue to play out over and over again. I'm sure there was a lot of individuals who probably felt some kind of way towards those in charge for allowing some of these guys who had charges against women and children to be out on the same yard with them. My source said that a lot of them just went with the program and wouldn't speak on it out of fear of reprisal. So guys like Edward Morgan were allowed to remain out there and nobody questioned it. Eric Bennett, another Wood from Orange County, was someone else who created problems. If you guys remember, one of the first videos I put out on this Death Row series actually involved this guy Eric Bennett and him getting rushed by Juan Coronado, Frog from Riverside. Frog was a solid Sureño who didn't have no smut on him and was only guilty of trying to push politics the way he was taught to push them. He didn't like the fact that this guy Eric Bennett was on the same yard with him because of his charges. And Frog was supposedly real vocal about it. So one day they're out there on the yard and I don't know exactly what happened, but Frog, he apparently felt disrespected. So he socked this guy Eric Bennett in the mouth. Unfortunately for Frog, this guy Eric Bennett was also someone Ronnie took a liking to. So this put Frog in Ronnie's crosshairs. So not long after that incident, Ronnie sends 2 other Sureños on Frog to pack him out as a form of discipline. Where's the logic in that? Better question. What kind of message does this send to the other Sureños who are out there and who've seen this all play out? So again, let me make it clear that no, I'm not putting these stories out to smut Ronnie up or to put him in a bad light. I'm just conveying the stories to you guys as they're being given to me. So I don't have a personal dislike for Ronnie. Like I said, I was never on a tier with him. I was on the tier with his brother Hector. And I will say that Hector was a cool ass dude. I got along with Hector. He was my drinking partner. Me and Hector used to break bread and drink wine together on the tier in the adjustment center. But it is what it is, and it ain't what it ain't. A lot of the fallout that built up over these years when Death Row was still in San Quentin is still playing out right now on some of these level 4 main lines. And I believe that there's still things that happened that are still being looked into. Only time will tell, but eventually everything comes full circle. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys like this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, I want to thank you guys for your unwavering support and for continuing to support this channel. As I've said many times before in the past, this channel would be nothing and would cease to exist without you guys, the viewers. Until the next one, you guys enjoy the rest of your week and keep pushing that positivity. With that said, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.